Welcome everyone. I am Sherry Ely and I'm the Program Director for Juvenile Justice for the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. Thank you for taking an interest in such an important topic. This webinar is part of a larger initiative by NCJ-FCJ to address domestic child sex trafficking. This webinar is supported by funding from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. The views, opinions, and content of this webinar are those of the presenters and are not endorsed by OJJDP. The topic for the webinar today was selected because children in foster care and out-of-home placements are disproportionately victimized by sex trafficking. NCJ-FCJ would be remiss to not acknowledge the duty of juvenile and family courts to recognize and screen for this risk and implement best court practices to address the trafficking of court-involved children. I have the privilege to introduce today's faculty. Judge John J. Romero, Jr. is a judge in the Children's Court Division of the 2nd Judicial District Court in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Ms. Tina Front is the founder and executive director of Courtney's House in Washington, D.C. Ms. Front is a member of the Washington, D.C. Anti-Trafficking Task Force and a member of the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. Ms. Yasmin Vafa is the co-founder and executive director for Rights for Girls in Washington, D.C., and she is the co-author of the report on the Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline. All three of our presenters today are longtime faculty members for NCJ-FCJ's National Judicial Institute on Domestic Child Sex Trafficking. Let's kick things off today with a poll question. Do you believe that your local foster care, group home, or shelter care placement options are safe from traffickers? Please click on one of the 5 responses to rate your agreement or your disagreement with this statement. It appears from the results that many of you disagree with this statement or are undecided, so I think you're at the right place today with this webinar. But please ask yourself this follow-up question. Are you sure of your response, and is your response based upon your first-hand knowledge of these placements and or feedback you've received from youth in these placements? NCJ-FCJ encourages judges to step off the bench and court teams to leave the courthouse to visit the placement options in your own communities. Gathering feedback from youth in placements is one tactic to help monitor the safety and potential for trafficking that may occur in these placements. I now turn it over to Judge John Romero for further introduction to this issue. Judge?
Thank you, Sherry, and thank you to my co-presenters and also to all of the participants who are on this webinar today. I'm going to just talk a little bit about what I know the most, and that's what's going on in my own jurisdiction. And like so many places nationally, what was taking place with kids being trafficked is they were hidden in plain sight. We didn't know that our dependency kids or our juvenile justice kids who were presenting with other charges or other concerns that they were also being trafficked. So much is being done nationally to bring about an awareness. But in my own state, I'm happy to report that we have a new secretary of our Children, Youth, and Families Department. One of the things that was lacking was the declaration of a standard validated screening tool to be used statewide within at least the child welfare system. And the West Coast Children's Clinic commercial sexual exploitation identification tool is what is now being required as a screening tool in our child welfare department. Another change that was made by our new secretary is the requirement that any calls made to our statewide central intake, the intake for the 800 number when people call to report child abuse, any of those calls alleging trafficking of youth, receives a priority 1 designation that must be investigated immediately, certainly within 24 hours. Another significant change that was low-hanging fruit was to amend our delinquency code so that prostitution as an offense is excluded. Children under the age of 18 may not be charged with prostitution. It's a different version of safe harbor without all of the fancy bells and whistles, but it's a step in the right direction. And legislatively, there are plans to do more by legislative activists in the state of New Mexico. We also have a New Mexico Human Trafficking Task Force under the auspices of the New Mexico Attorney General's Office. They're engaged in statewide trainings at schools, at community groups, and I believe today or tomorrow training in our community college nursing program, which is encouraging that those in the healthcare profession will have a heads up and an awareness of what's going on with youth they come into contact with. The New Mexico Human Trafficking Task Force has gone online very recently with their new website, and it provides access to the task force members and to the general public on issues involving human trafficking in the state of New Mexico, again creating a different level of awareness. The final part I'd like to talk about is there are a number of services in the state of New Mexico, but they've been open generally only to adults, those 18 years of age or older. There have been other entities in the state that really didn't know about each other. We didn't know about them, but recently a non-governmental organization, community-based and supported by non-government dollars, a drop-in center for homeless youth, including kids up to the age of 21. That's open in Albuquerque, the Harbor, the New Mexico Dream Center. It is a drop-in center. It's not a residential treatment place, but it is a safe place with resources that are provided to those who come in voluntarily, no strings attached, an opportunity to establish trust and a safe place for these young folks to go to. Staffed principally by volunteers from the community, those who have a desire and a passion for being a resource to homeless kids, many of whom, of course, end up being trafficked if they're not already being trafficked. I'd like to segue over to the rest of the presentation. I count it a real privilege and an honor to be presenting with Yasmin and with Tina. Each of them passionate advocates in their own rights from the different places that they serve in. Each of them well known nationally as well as locally, and ever busy with advocating in Congress or at the local legislative bodies, and each of them an expert who acknowledge that the real experts are the survivors of this exploitation. So Yasmin's going to talk to us about the issue connected with trafficking and foster care, and she can talk a lot more about many other things, but that's our focus today. Yasmin?
Hi there, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you all today. I think one of the most important things to start off discussing when we look at issues of child sex trafficking is definitions, and to make sure that we are all on the same page when we discuss what it is we mean when we say domestic child sex trafficking. And so for the purposes of today's webinar, we are using definitions as prescribed under federal law. The seminal piece of federal anti-trafficking legislation is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or the TVPA. This was the law that was first adopted in the year 2000 and has subsequently been updated and reauthorized in order to govern our national and international response to human trafficking. Sometimes you will see distinctions that maybe seem somewhat arbitrary. For instance, the domestic child sex trafficking definition. However, the reason for that is because the federal anti-trafficking law does prescribe different treatment, different services, and different interventions depending on specific subsets of the human trafficking victim population. So, for example, the TVPA makes certain prescriptions based on whether the victim population are adults or whether they are minors, whether they are foreign nationals or whether they are domestic victims, and whether they are victims of sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And so again, for the purposes of today's webinar, we are focusing on domestic child sex trafficking victims who under the TVPA are defined as children who have been induced to perform commercial sex acts where they are under the age of 18 and they are U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents. It's important to note that under the federal definitions, when there is a minor under the age of 18 who is involved, there is no need to prove force, fraud, or coercion. Just the mere existence of a child in the commercial sex trade is sufficient to show child sex trafficking. Under the federal law, it's important to realize that a commercial sex act is defined very broadly. It is defined as any sex act exchanged for anything of value. So again, there doesn't need to be a monetary transaction. This can include sex that is exchanged for basic necessities such as food, shelter, or clothing. It's also important to note that though most of us are probably seeing and dealing with children who are exploited through the system of prostitution, child sex trafficking under the federal law is not limited to exploitation through prostitution. It can also include children who are found exploited in stripping in massage parlors through pornography, for example. And so that's also important to realize under the federal definitions. Of course, this isn't a new phenomenon. Unfortunately, many of us have been dealing with this issue and this population for several decades. Trafficking is, the new term that we are using to describe this concept. However, for many, many years, this issue was referred to as sometimes child prostitution, underage prostitution, teen sex workers are all terms that we've probably heard and used to describe this population, but these are terms that we as a movement are really moving away from and really pushing back against. All of these terms really promote a sense of agency and criminality that, of course, doesn't exist when we're talking about children who can't even legally consent. Another term that is somewhat problematic is survival sex. This is a term that we often hear used with respect to our runaway and homeless youth population. And really this goes back to what we were just talking about a moment ago, where there may not necessarily be a trafficker or a third-party exploiter, but there is a buyer who is willing to exploit a child's vulnerabilities. And so survival sex, quote unquote, is the term that's usually used to define scenarios where a child is exchanging sex with an adult who's a sex buyer in order to meet their needs. So oftentimes trading a sex act in exchange for shelter or clothing or food. And so again, this is a term that we really discourage in the sense that it really puts the focus and the onus on the child. It really masks the harm and the violence and exploitation that's taking place, and it really obscures the exploitative actors, mainly the sex buyers, who are the ones who are essentially trafficking these children. And so that's another term that we would suggest moving away from and realizing is just another form of child sex trafficking. The last two terms are used fairly interchangeably with domestic child sex trafficking. They're widely accepted. CSEC, or the commercial sexual exploitation of children, as well as DMST, or domestic minor sex trafficking. These are terms that you will hear used fairly frequently to describe the same victim population. So why are we even taking time to talk about language? Why is it important to be mindful of the words that we are using to describe these children? Well, at Rights for Girls, we believe very strongly that how we are named is how we are treated. And so it's really important to take great care as practitioners, as those who are entrusted to work with this population and treat this population, because the ways in which we talk about this issue really indicate the ways in which these children are not only perceived, but they are treated by first responders and other system stakeholders, but also the ways in which these children identify themselves. It's not surprising that because of the terminology and the ways in which we have discussed this issue over time, that many domestic child sex trafficking victims don't self-identify as trafficked. Many of them actually have a great deal of victim blaming that they've internalized. And so we think it's really important to be mindful and take great care with the language that we are using. So much so that we partnered with a survivor of child sex trafficking to launch a campaign called the No Such Thing campaign to make it unequivocally clear that there is no such thing as a child prostitute, that very term is an oxymoron, because if children cannot legally consent to sex, how is it then that we are punishing them and criminalizing them for their own exploitation? And so the campaign really sought to interrogate the concept of the child prostitute, not only in our language, but also in our laws, so that we are no longer able to actually criminalize children for their own exploitation. The goals of the campaign were to encourage lawmakers and policymakers to enact policies to end the arrest and prosecution of child victims of sex trafficking, to make sure that we are centering the voices and needs of survivors, and as well to promote the deterrence and accountability for sex buyers and others who are actually harming our children. And so through the campaign, we've really worked to not only shift the way the media has talked about this issue, because of course how the media talks about these issues really informs how the public perceives them, as well as working to shift the narrative over time so that our lawmakers and our states can enact policies that treat these children as the victims of crime and the victims of child abuse that they truly are. And so we're going to take a quick look at a video right now that really enshrines the principles of no such thing.
Thanks, Yasmin. And so, hi everyone, this is Patricia. Just a reminder that the audio for this video will be played through your computer speakers and not through your phone. So if you're dialed in, unfortunately, you won't be able to hear this portion. But if you are logged on, feel free to just raise the volume on your computer speakers to hear the video properly. Thank you.
There is no such thing as a child prostitute.
Listen, I don't talk to strangers, you know? And he was like, okay, and drives off. And I don't know, something just gave me a weird feeling. I turn around, he's coming back around the corner, and he's hop out the car with a gun, like, get in the car, get in the car.
There are only victims and survivors of child rape. Child sex trafficking is alive and real in the United States. Young girls are being bought and sold for sex in large numbers. Yet, instead of being seen as victims, they are treated as criminals, charged as child prostitutes, while their buyers often go free. It's time for that to end.
323 to 584.
Children all across this country are at risk of being victims of human trafficking. Girls are kidnapped or lured by traffickers at bus shelters, outside schools, or through social media. In big cities, in rural areas, at truck stops on the interstate, many of them are branded or beaten into submission.
I was sold in strip clubs. I was sold in massage parlors. He didn't care what it was as long as I made his quota. And if I didn't make his quota, I was beat, bruised, broken, tortured.
At the same time that the girls are locked up behind bars, their buyers are most often free to go. In any other situation, an adult who engaged in sexual acts with a child would be punished and charged with a felony. In 2015, Rights for Girls launched the No Such Thing campaign, urging the Associated Press, a media leader, to abandon the term child prostitute to describe victims of child sex trafficking. In response to our efforts, the AP revised its influential style book to instruct writers to stop using the term child prostitute to describe child trafficking. Although we have successfully changed the language, we must now change the laws. Around the country, cities and states have used the No Such Thing campaign to pass laws that protect survivors and hold buyers and exploiters accountable.
No child should be arrested for prostitution.
Child prostitution.
Child sex trafficking.
Underage prostitution.
Child sex trafficking.
Child prostitute.
There is no such thing.
No such thing.
No such thing as a child prostitute.
Join our movement at rightsforgirls.org. Help us make it clear that there is no such thing as a child prostitute.
I think it's really important. Thank you, Patricia. And so I think that as the video makes clear, there's a number of really important risk factors that are pretty pervasive when we look at this victim population. Of course, we often hear common narratives of childhood abuse and neglect, family conflict, family dysfunction. Many of these children who are vulnerable are runaway and homeless youth. Many of them identify as LGBT. And of course, we know that child welfare involvement seems to be a very common precursor. In fact, current data from across the country suggests that many, if not most, trafficked children have a history of child welfare involvement, oftentimes through foster care, and often the more placements they've had, the more likely it is that they've experienced some form of sexual exploitation, but as well through CPS, for example, if they've experienced abuse or neglect. And so we've looked at some of the data from across the states. Nationally, we know from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC, that they've reported over 80% of child sex trafficking victims who have been reported to them were from foster care or social services. Back in 2013, when NCMEC and FBI partnered on one of their nationwide raids to recover children in the sex industry, they found that over 60% of the children that they rescued were from foster care or group homes. Similarly, when we look at some of the available state data, we see this common correlation between identified victims of trafficking with a history of child welfare involvement. And so you'll see here the data from New York, as well as some of the data that we've seen from parts of California, LA County. 80% of the children from the collaborative court in LA County, the STAR Court program, had a history of child welfare involvement. Similarly, Alameda County reported that over 50% of the CSEC population there were from foster care and group homes. And so again, though it's important to recognize that we are talking about children who are in the foster care system who have an acute vulnerability to trafficking, we will talk a little bit later about instances of familial trafficking, which is another manifestation of sexual exploitation that lands children in the child welfare system. But perhaps no data, I think, it is going to hit this point home further than this quote from a survivor of child sex trafficking who was actually featured in the video that you just saw. And what she did was really describe the ways in which her status as a foster care youth rendered her more vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation. And what she said was that, in her view, foster care was a perfect training ground for a life of trafficking, because it was in foster care throughout her various placements where she first internalized the concept of being cared for, but also being abused. And it was also in foster care where she internalized the notion of being tied to income. And so those two realities ingrained in her mind from such a young age made the eventual transition into a life of trafficking with her exploiter a very seamless transition for her. And I think this quote is just a really poignant way of illustrating the distinct vulnerability that children in our foster care system have. And for many of us who are practitioners or advocates, who've worked on these issues for many years, not realizing the extent to which this system that is, entrusted to care for some of our most vulnerable youth was actually in many ways conditioning them for a life of exploitation in the sex trade. And so as a result of some of the data that we were able to collect, as well as the courageous testimony from survivors like T before Congress, we were able to pass a law called the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act. And the goal of this legislation was to really address the vulnerability of children in the foster care system by requiring state child welfare agencies to really improve and ramp up their response towards this population. And so now, as a requirement of Title IV-E funding, state child welfare agencies are required to screen all children in their existing caseload for sex trafficking, to connect those children with appropriate services, and to document those numbers. In addition, T, in her testimony before Congress, also said that, for kids in foster care, when we go missing, there's no Amber Alerts for us. No one looks for us. Oftentimes these children are just marked as AWOL, or there's an assumption that they, went to go live with their friend or their boyfriend and that they're fine. And, what T and other survivors made very clear to us was that in some cases they're being kidnapped, in some cases they're actually being exploited. And so it's really important for state agencies to report these children who are missing. And so now, as a requirement of the Preventing Sex Trafficking Act, state child welfare agencies are required to report any child missing from care to both the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is our national clearinghouse of data on exploited youth and missing youth throughout the country, as well as the FBI for entry into the NCIC database. And so this is really important, because if children are reported missing from, a congregate care facility in one state, oftentimes NCMEC has found that these are the children who are later identified as trafficked in a neighboring state or jurisdiction. And so really important to make sure that we're reporting that data, as well as documenting these findings in the AFCAR system, which is the Adoption and Foster Care Analysis and Reporting System. There are a number of data points that currently exist that state child welfare agencies should be tracking for under AFCARs, and so this legislation simply made child sex trafficking an additional data point, which we should be tracking data for across the country, which should then populate to the federal Health and Human Services Department so that they can collect and disseminate that information. So I think now we have another poll and want to gauge from our participants whether your state child welfare agency regularly reports children who are missing to NCMEC. So this is actually quite promising. I mean, it's better results than I think many of us were expecting. Typically, you know, when we talk about these issues, many participants are absolutely, you know, it's the first time that they're hearing about this requirement. So it seems like, you know, in some of your states that this actually is happening, which is good to see.
Yasmin, if I may chime in before the next poll question, I think as judicial officers, we have a responsibility to not assume that our child welfare agency is making those reports, but to ask the question. Sometimes it has to be asked discreetly, but we need to know the answers. And nationally, there's huge turnover among child welfare workers, and even though they the predecessors may have been trained and required to do that, when someone else comes into the case and they may be new or didn't have the training, the only way they're going to be reminded to do that is that judicial officers during hearings make the inquiry.
Exactly. I think that's really important for judges to realize the role that they have in making sure that some of these aspects of the law are implemented and complied with. You know, obviously, as advocates, we know that there have been several gaps and you know, in the child welfare response. One of the other things that we have consistently recognized in states is that in many jurisdictions, if you were to seek to report an instance of child sex trafficking to your local child welfare hotline or agency, in most cases, they wouldn't be able to intervene and would declare that child sex trafficking would be outside of their purview unless the abuse was being carried out by a parent or caretaker. And so oftentimes what this does is it requires a referral to law enforcement, which, as we know, oftentimes ends up criminalizing the child, not recognizing them as a victim of crime or victim of child abuse. And so in 2015, a law was passed at the federal level to really ramp up many aspects of our response to domestic victims of human trafficking. And one of the things that it did was it amended CAPTA, or the Federal Child Abuse Prevention Treatment Act, to designate child sex trafficking as a form of abuse or neglect under federal definition. And so really this was to signal to states to start contemplating the fact that at its core, child sex trafficking is a form of child abuse, and that it's really important for these children to be treated in the child welfare system to the extent possible, rather than being referred to the delinquency or juvenile justice system. And so our third poll question, asking whether or not your states recognize child sex trafficking as a form of abuse and neglect, that falls under child welfare. Again, we know more states have started adopting these laws, but you know, there are a number of jurisdictions that are still struggling with being able to respond to the needs of child sex trafficking victims under a DCF response. So it looks like most of your states are actually allowing child welfare to intervene in these types of cases. I'm sure, you know, we'll talk about a little bit later that that's not always, you know, a perfect response. However, you know, stressing the importance of making sure that these children are in fact served in the child welfare system rather than referring them to juvenile justice and requiring essentially their court involvement or criminalization in order to get services. And so, the next law that we really wanted to highlight is the Family First Prevention Services Act that was recently passed. Obviously, the goals of this legislation were to provide more flexibility to child welfare and allow, the use of 4E dollars to help prevent children from being pushed into the foster care system to begin with. I'm going to turn it over to Judge Romero, who's going to talk a little bit more about the specificities of Family First with respect to this population.
Thank you, Yasmin. Well, very simply, Family First Prevention Services Act makes some very important changes on how Title 4E funding may be used. And it kind of turns the child welfare system on its head because the focus should be on prevention rather than bringing kids into state custody and usually the result being something other than reunifying, protecting, or helping children or families. Some of the states across the country actually began implementation of Families First this past October, last month. Many others have exercised the option to delay full implementation until 2021. Among the goals of Family First Prevention Services Act is to encourage the greater use of preventative services in the community, in the home, rather than institutions like group homes, other congregate care forms, and certainly residential treatment centers. The services under the Families First Act that may be offered are mental health services, substance abuse services, and parenting programs. Many of the survivors of sex trafficking are young kids, but they have young kids of their own. They're also parents. To the extent that survivors of sex trafficking may be welcomed back into their home and the families of origin will participate in services under Families First, that of course is relevant as far as parenting education programs, and then many of the family members themselves struggling with mental health and substance use disorders. So Families First dollars offer a great opportunity to deal with these families in a preventative way rather than court involvement in such a way as to make them feel as though they're being criminalized, even though the cases are not criminal in nature. The question of who's eligible for these services, there are a lot of definitions in the Act, a candidate for foster care. The federal act doesn't really define what that is and leaves it to the discretion of the individual states to put a definition together or to determine who indeed is a candidate for foster care. Certainly a child who is already in foster care, who is either a pregnant child or is parenting already, is someone who's eligible for Family First Prevention Services. And again, parents or kin caregivers of the youth maybe those who are also eligible to receive services. And it's argued very strongly that trafficked youth, or those who are at risk for being trafficked, meet some of these criteria for Title 4E Family First Prevention Services. Title 4E defines what foster care is, so Title 4E funds may be used to support, based on Families First and its expansion, to provide services for trafficked youth, as I've already said, those who are at risk of being trafficked, and they may actually be eligible to be placed in highly qualified residential care or residential treatment centers. But again, the devil's in the details of what a qualified residential care setting and program may be. And within those settings, they could receive supportive services, but I noticed that some of the folks have raised concern that many of these kids really don't trust the system. How would they end up there anyway? Well, that's another issue that needs to be dealt with, and it's going to take time to get there, but we're not there right now. Also, what's interesting about Families First is that it can include youth who are 18 years of age or older, and typically many of those are kids who have aged out of foster care and are in some form of supervised independent living program. Families First also not only sets very stringent requirements for qualified residential treatment programs. Among those stringent requirements is that in family foster homes, not in residential treatment, you can't have any more. These are government-provided foster family homes. No more than 25 participants in those programs. Families First places a premium on having children placed with relatives, and Yasmin raised earlier the issue of familial pimping. That's another obstacle in how do you place children in relative placements when the families themselves may be the exploiters. Another detail that needs to be worked out. The new rules that I mentioned earlier, the stringent requirements, it's important that the services offered to a child in qualified residential treatment be individualized for that particular child's needs, not a one-size-fits-all. The evaluations of these programs must be conducted by folks qualified to determine whether it's a qualified residential treatment program. Among many of the requirements is that it has to be evidence-based, and that program must also be trauma-informed. Exactly what that means depends on how you interpret all of that, but at least it's pointing in the right direction. Again, another requirement there in that third bullet point is that the youth and the youth's family must be involved. How do we define the family? Certainly we don't want the family to be those who are exploiting the children. And a question that I don't know the answer to is are fictive kin eligible as family members? Certainly in most child welfare systems, those who are known to the child and who the child trusts can be determined to be family. Whether that's going to be interpreted that way under Families First remains to be seen. Another point of interest for judicial officers and court systems is that placement in a qualified residential treatment facility must be approved by the court. And there need to be regular reviews of each youth's progress. And are we working toward a meaningful transition program? Is that review done in court in the form of a hearing? Is it submitted in writing? How exactly that looks is probably going to be dependent on how each state implements Families First. One of the concerns that our tribal brethren have raised is evidence-based. How does that factor into cultural practices in our tribal community? Well, one of the organizations analyzing Families First asserts that the requirements will not be as stringent for tribal preventative programs and that HHS may permit the provision of services in tribal programs as long as they're adapted to the context and the culture of the tribe providing the service. I guess the long story short is that there will be a limited set of child care institutions, residential treatment centers, group homes, etc., that qualify for Title IV funding under Families First. Among those that are very clear are qualified residential treatment programs, specialized programs for youth who have experience or are at risk of being engaged in the sex trafficking, exploitation, and also child care institutions that provide supervised independent living programs for youth who are 18 years of age or older. Again, a reminder, and it's important to underscore that these qualified programs must be evidence-based. They must be trauma-informed. And the final slide that I'll click over to here in just a minute has to do with other resources available to you that can tell you a whole lot more about Families First than I ever could. I encourage you to click onto those when you have an opportunity and know a little bit about what's going on with Families First and how it affects youth who are being trafficked or are at risk of being trafficked. I'd like at this time to turn the floor over to Tina, who is going to share what is being done at Courtney's house and their collaboration with the Washington, D.C. Child and Family Services Agency and other issues that she may want to raise during her presentation. Tina?
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar today. So there are a few things we want to discuss today within perspective. So it's been almost 2 years in D.C. where CFSA and Courtney's house created an approach to CSEC that also included partnering with the Direct Services Agency, specializing in sex trafficking. So this approach includes identifying potential sex trafficked youth, data collection, ongoing training for all social workers, CPS investigators, and hotlines, direct services, CSEC review meetings, foster parent training, and parent support groups, and foster parents. Let's talk about that. I want to break that down. I want to go through them and then kind of break down what each of those really means. So when we kind of developed what approach would work in our area, I'm glad that CFSA was able, and that's DC's foster care, was able to include us in the whole entire progress. So not the progress after they figured out what was going to happen, but figure it out together and what approaches might be the best. With that being said, of course CFSA had to have a requirement where they had to screen individual youth. So I think that's important. So that screening, that tool that they use inside of foster care, it's just a mere screening tool to kind of put people where you believe that they may need more questions. So I need you all to think about screening tools as more of a flush out that maybe this youth does need more services. And then a different type of screening progress is Courtney's house that we created within youth. Data collection. We all know that data collection is the one thing that we don't have enough of. So let's define what data collection means. When people think about data collection, I think we're only focusing on the numbers that's being referred, or maybe, the demographic of the youth that are being trafficked, what their gender is. But are we actually tracking where the locations are? So we're continuing to find youth inside of foster care with the addresses and information. How many of those youth are going to the same exact location? So I think it's important that we're also capturing real live data. So when a youth comes back into care, are we finding out the information of where they were? So working with Courtney's house, we find out a lot more information that we're able to work together with. And that's important because what if you have 7 or 8 youth? We're all picked up from the same area over time that do not know each other. So think about how you're going to be collecting that sort of data. We're also keeping who are the traffickers? Who are these people with? Was it their parents? Was there other people involved that were trafficking them? So think about what type of data you want to collect within that. The other thing that we are doing ongoing with social workers need to be trained. But we all know that the high turnover rates with social workers and CPS investigators, that we need to have ongoing training every 3 to 6 months. It's really important to continue to do that. So that's one thing that we also do that Courtney's house is able to train the social workers and CPS investigators as well. The CSEC review meetings are really important. That's commercially sexually exploited children review meetings. Talk about what that means. Not just for people inside of foster care. We kind of need everyone, right, at the table. We need CPS investigators, we need social workers, we need mental health people that are at the table who see the youth as well. We need all of them there so that we can make sure that they're all getting the services that they need. And what services, quite frankly, that is repetitive, that they may not need. Also, each person at the table has more information on the youth. Remember that database you were just talking about? It's also important to kind of collect the data that everyone is saying. So we're all on the same page together and that we're working as a team. Foster care parent training. So Courtney's house provides parent support groups, and we provide foster parent training. So I think it's really important that we have ongoing foster parent training. on an ongoing level. We all know that foster care has requirements for foster parents, and they have mandated trainings. I think a lot of people are afraid to kind of mandate foster parents to more training because they have so many things that they have to do. But we feel like this is important because how can you keep youth in your home if you're not being adequately trained and you're not having the information and you're not part of the team? So we can't leave foster parents out as part of the team as well as replacing the foster parents. The next thing is those parent support groups doesn't just mean their parents, right? Parent support groups are also for foster parents. What we were really finding is that we have a 24-hour hotline at Courtney. It was actually foster parents who were calling the most our hotline, with the most concerns, with the most questions on how to deal with the youth that are actively inside the home. And that really pushed us to have more formalized foster parent support groups. And think about it this way. When a youth is being trafficked, right, we always are so heavy on services for the youth. But if the parent isn't part of the trafficking, what type of services are we putting for them? What type of resources are we putting for foster parents who have youth in their homes? And think about it this way. What if you're a foster parent and you have 4 youth in your home and they were all sex trafficked? You would definitely need more support and services for that. The next piece within that, the identification of at-risk youth through those screening tools that we talked briefly about, and the biweekly CSEC reviews. Let's talk about that because you know how we all are. These meetings, these biweekly, these monthly meetings, will meeting you to death. But this actually is super important because you know that working with youth, things change so quickly. And all of us have to quickly be on the same page. And we also know within our screening tools that we use, it's also going to determine what type of services they need and who are part of these meetings. So let's talk about those people I told you about that are all part of these team meetings and who they are. So we're also talking about the guardian ad litem is part of that, the social worker, the therapist, other lawyers if they're CFSA lawyers or foster care lawyers are also a part of this as well. The therapist, past therapists. Now listen to what I just said, past therapists that they do not currently see. That's important because that actually gives you your background information. They haven't seen them in a year, but they did go a year ago. Where was that gap? What happened? Do we know what happened to have them go further away? A lot of our youth are gone for long periods of time. But they did talk to a therapist a year or so ago that had more information that we had. So think about back history as well, and including the people that they may not currently see right now as well. The monthly team meeting, so now we're talking about biweekly screening meetings and team meetings. So a biweekly screening meeting is, what if you're in foster care? We know how big foster care can be. And you are in a different unit and you believe you have a youth as trafficked. How do you even heighten that and let your supervisor know? Well, there were so many different referrals. They had foster care in DC created a monthly meeting, which I think is great because we can go and review what everyone's seeing. All the other service agencies that may have even touched this youth can also add input within it and how to connect with the youth and who the best person would be to connect with the youth. So one of the reasons why foster care in DC decided to partner with Courtney's House, and remember, this is a contract and not a grant. We're survivor founded in Rome. Courtney's House, and I think that's interesting. When we're thinking about partnering organizations, yes, sometimes you're lucky enough to have a survivor in your area, but you don't necessarily have to have a survivor in your area. Or you can partner with survivor-run organizations that's out of your area to help you with your program. So that's important because sometimes there's a different aspect of what we do. One of the things we do differently is actually we work with boys. So we work with boys and girls. So that's also important that we're identifying boys and girls. So as DC foster care system identifying males as well, definitely they are. And that's also included in their training as well. Participants, we do internal case reviews and emergency on-call. Let's talk about what emergency on-call means. That can mean within foster care. Say a youth is missing and has been missing for a while. Well, a lot of our youth, we still contact them when they're missing. And then they are able to come to the center. When they come to the center, we're able to contact foster care so that they can return and even talk with them about the place and why they left. So sometimes there has to be a bridge that connects them as well to the services, the social worker, and what was really going on in that country. So we can do that as well on that. One of the other things that's unique with this contract is that DC Foster Care pays Courtney's house to have social workers that we call survivor service coordinators to work with youth that are in the foster care system. So our social workers work with youth that are in foster care, along with the social workers in foster care as well. Think about it this way. They have so many cases, and sometimes the relationship isn't where it needs to be. We can build those relationships and merge them together so that the youth trust us, and then they can trust their social worker as well. One of the other things that was created out of these laws we're talking about is Hope Court. Hope Court, actually, when I'm talking about what that means, is a commercially sexually exploited youth program. It's a court for youth who may have been trafficked, and it's also for youth who are in the neglect system. It was created by a team of professionals, including CFSA, court services, nonprofits, mental health, and judges as well. Neglect cases are screened and placed in Hope Court. There are team staffings, and they evaluate all the eligibility for Hope Court youth. This is a choice. So I also want you to know that this Hope Court is a choice, and youth are able to enter Hope Court or not, and they can talk with their attorneys about if that is the best fit for them. I think the good thing about our services, though, is even when court is done, you can still stay in our program. So maybe you're saying, well, how many youth actually do that? To be honest with you, only over 90% of our youth stay in our program. I'm going to say the other 10% come back later on in life. So we don't have people that don't want to stay, and that's why it's important to connect them to services, right, throughout the whole entire progress, so they're already having things that are there. Now, who does Courtney's House serve? So Courtney's House works with survivors of sex trafficking. So that is my population. I do not have an at-risk population. We are male, female, LGBTQIA, and our ages at Courtney's House are 11 to 24. 24 means that you enter when you're 24, but of course you can stay in after you age out of 24. And that's important that we create a family and that long-term process of it, because that healing process, as we all know, is a long-term process. Courtney's House serves a drop-in center. We are not housing. We are a long-term services and drop-in center. Let me explain why that's important. We're open on weekends, so we all know that it's very difficult to find services for youth that are also open on weekends. We have a group chat in our Instagram that we talk to all of the youth constantly. So we have a family environment for the youth as well. At our drop-in center, there are lots of things that we do. One, it is a house. Even though that it's not housing, yes, it is a house, and it should be a house. Drop-in centers should not be office buildings. And I think that's important because youth don't want to hang out in the office building. You want a space where they deem as their own. So in that space, a lot of things happen. One, they can meet with their survivor service coordinator, their case manager. But I think it's also important to know they can meet with other services at Courtney's House. Their guardian ad litem comes to Courtney's House. If they have counseling, they come to Courtney's House. So, there are other, like mental health social workers, come to Courtney's House. Even sometimes intake for housing and other things, we get them there. Now, why do we do it that way? Because our youth are coming in for our services, but they're not showing up sometimes at others. So we try to partner so that we are a one-stop shop at Courtney's House. So I'm really looking forward to everyone's questions. I just want to focus and say that at Courtney's House, we see pimp control, gang control, family, and of course, males as well. Each one is a different of control. 30% of our population at Courtney's House is trafficked by their family. So how are we working with youth that were trafficked with their families in a long-term way? Looking forward to hearing everyone's questions. Thank you.
Tina, some of our presenters are having a little bit of trouble hearing you, so if you can just speak a little bit more loudly, I think they'd be able to discern it better. But we also have some information on a slide about sex trafficking assessments in the DC area.
Yes. So the assessment, excuse me, I'm actually in the mountains in Hawaii, so I apologize, but it kind of goes in and out. So my apologies for if you're not able to hear me. So one of the things about the assessments, our assessments are broken down into temp control, gang control, family, and boys. Each one has a different dynamic of control. So our questions are totally different. It is specific to different trafficking situations. How do we know to ask those questions? Because the times when we meet them, the first 2 to 3 times, we're having conversations. We're not jumping into an assessment. By the third time, they've opened up and shared a lot, that we know how to gauge the assessment and where they are to answer that question for you all. Could everyone hear me better?
Yes, that was more clear. We now have time for a few questions from our webinar participants for any of our 3 presenters today, for Judge John Romero, Yasmin Vafa, or Tina Front. If you have a very specific question rather than a comment, if you can type a concise question in the chat box, we will present that to our faculty for today. And from earlier monitoring the chat box, I have a few questions that I can use to get that started off. One of the questions has to do with what you were just speaking to, Tina, regarding Hope Court and Courtney's house. And there is a question about how youth are identified and get involved in Hope Court. And do you know what type of assessment tool the court uses?
Yes, so the court uses the STAR assessment tool, and that's just the 10-point screen. 10-point screening is just to kind of see if they think that more questions should be asked when they refer to an organization. So know that. So then how do they review them? That monthly CSEC review meeting that I was telling you about, it consists of the Children Advocacy Center, DP Foster Care, CPS, social workers as well. So these are screening calls that are coming into CPS as well. So you want the CPS workers there, calls that came in that are flagged. Now, it could not just be calls. Say that school. We got so many for different schools that are referring to us too. So I would kick it up to the CSEC review meeting for the whole entire DC, right? So that's the government, that's foster care, that's mental health. And then people add. So in these meetings, a lot of times we know the youth, other people know the youth, and they can add pieces to that to see, right, if they're eligible for Hope Court. And also can be if they're on probation and have some other stat cases.
Great. And do you know if Hope Court or Courtney's House Services, are they available and open to undocumented immigrants?
Yes, has always been. Actually, before I started Courtney's House, I worked with undocumented immigrants, so we definitely do this.
And do any of our presenters know what the percentage is nationally for boys versus girls being trafficked?
So, I mean, I think it's important. Well, real quick, I'll just chime in, and then, Tina, you can talk more about what you guys have found at your program. But it's important to remember that this is a demand-driven industry, right? So I think it changes depending on what the demand is for young boys versus young girls, or, you know, gender nonconforming youth. So I think that's important to keep in mind. There's no, you know, static stats that we can throw out. However, we have found consistently that when staff are trained on screening for boys, that the number of identified victims goes up. You know, boys are definitely underreported, but again, because it's a demand-driven industry, it fluctuates. Like, you know, the number of boys in one jurisdiction might be much lower statistically than another jurisdiction. where the demand for boys may be higher. But you know, we know that they are underreported for sure, and that they tend to be much younger.
And I would definitely say because we're not screening, right? If you're not screening for boys, you're not getting also. When we talk about screening, we keep screening when they're 12 and 13, but we're not screening enough when they're under the age of 12, when most of our boys are trafficked under the age of 12, right? We don't have any boys that's over 16. So think about where our gaps are that we're even missing.
I think another variable is the issue of males generally, and certainly boys who are coming of age, are not very willing to engage in counseling generally, let alone self-report or out themselves as being trafficked. There's also the misperception that if you're a boy being trafficked, somehow you must be gender nonconforming, you must be gay, and so there are a lot of obstacles for getting real good data on boys who are being trafficked. But we know for sure that it's not just a girl, a gender specific to girls being trafficked, but boys get trafficked too, whether they're LGBTQ youth, whether they're straight or whatever. Boys, especially as Tina pointed out, very young boys are being exploited.
There's another question, this might be best for Tina. How do you approach someone who is being trafficked by their family?
I think that's an excellent question. There's a few ways, though. There are a few things, and when I say that, I'll give you a quick scenario. So yes, we have a lot of youth that are trafficked by the family. They did not disclose that, or they recanted their trafficking situation in the past. So I find relationship building is really, really important, because those relationship building is going to make you understand the signs that they're talking about. It's a little different for us because, my trafficking situation included family. So it's something that we actually talk about in groups. So a lot of kids, and when we talk about their parents and what are the things they don't like, I'll be honest and say they are pretty clear on what those pieces are, even not with saying, hey, they trafficked me, but they talk about that abuse. Now, but the question should be, it takes a long time. This is their parents. So this is like any sexual abuse. You recant the story. There are other siblings sometimes involved, and you don't want them to get in trouble. So keep having that relationship with them. One of our youth, I went to see a youth who disclosed her parents. She actually told me that she looked up Courtney at 15, but she knew that her mother would never allow her to come to Courtney's house because of her situation. She admitted it was her mother, but kept recounting it and said, the only way I can kind of say something is to make sure that my brother, who's in a wheelchair, doesn't get displaced. So her parents telling her to say anything, foster care will take you to never see your brother. One of the things then was, if I talk to foster care, what can we do together to see if we can prevent this? So find out what the real things are and how you can work that in so they can say something and still feel safe.
There was a question more towards the start of the webinar when we were talking about federal legislation, and someone had mentioned they recently attended a JUST conference, and it was mentioned there that there was a federal law that had passed or maybe was possibly pending that requires all states to provide anti-human trafficking training in schools. Are you aware if this is part of Family First or other legislation, or if it's something that is pending?
So there's actually there's something that's certainly pending right now that we have supported and are looking to pass that would provide more funding towards training in schools. But there was a grant program that was passed as part of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the TVPA reauthorization this past year in 2018, that creates a new grant program to help bring anti-trafficking educational outreach to schools throughout the country. So that was passed as part of the TVPA reauthorization, but it's a grant program. So there is additional legislation that's pending to ramp up the amount of, schools are just an important link, and I think oftentimes are a system that's left out of the conversation. And so that is something that's being looked at, and there are a couple other bills that are pending right now to continue to ramp up and empower schools to better identify victims, receive, appropriate training for staff, and help get, children the services that they need. Because survivors tell us consistently that there were so many red flags that could have been addressed and seen in school. So it's a critical intervention opportunity, and one that I think legislators are realizing has been a gap in the field for a while.
I think federal funding for those kinds of programs is critical and, long overdue. However, I want to urge us all to think about that there are other community-based ways of doing the training, specifically to the kids in school themselves. And I think LA County, in their prevention program, I don't know if it was called Saturday School or what they called it, Yasmin, you know more about that than I, but where the LA County, I think, probation services launched out on their own, bringing about awareness to the kids and helping them better protect themselves by awareness of what's going on. So we don't have to wait on funding. If there's a need, there's got to be a way that it can be done without waiting on the funding.
Exactly, and many of our partners, like LA County, have both prevention and intervention curricula that they share, free of charge with other stakeholders throughout the country.
We have another question that is asking how you address in treatment for survivors substance use issues.
So for severe substance abuse issues, they would have to go to treatment. So most of our children youth are attached to a social worker or will be able to do a referral. We are not an intensive drug treatment program. So they need an in-house. They will have to do that first after they come out and we work together. If they don't need an in-house, they still go to drug treatment and we work together.
Earlier in the webinar, the term professional foster parents was used, and a question came up about this term and if it differs from what we think of as traditional foster parents, or what is mean by the term professional foster parent.
I can answer that for DC. We do have professional foster parents, not that many. And yes, the language differs. Let's just talk about real quickly what that means. A professional foster parent is a foster parent that's also trained on severe mental health issues, sex trafficking. So in our area, it's specifically for sex trafficked youth, and they have to go through a specific longer-term training for intensive trauma, mental health, and again, mandated with us too. The problem is there's not that many in our area. There are like 4 or 5, right? And 4 or 5 isn't going to help. I think we need way more professional foster homes than what we currently have in the area. And we need that. So these professional foster parents can also not work. They cannot work, stay at home, and get paid more to do those services. You need that. A lot of youth, like they need to have someone there with them all the time. Even if they have a baby, right, and they were sex trafficked, they need more care. This also means that a lot of youth won't be in that home. So you will either have just that one youth that's in your home or maybe 2, but they try to keep it to just that one. So the professional foster home, to me, is really catered for this population. But we need more.
I think in some jurisdictions there's a different term and it may mean something different, but treatment foster parents usually are those who have received additional training, extra training to care for kids with high needs, whether they're behavioral needs, mental health needs, or developmental needs. So I think that it's a short jump to say that we should have either treatment foster parents or professional foster parents who have specific training in dealing with youth who have been trafficked or are at risk for being trafficked, so we don't have the phenomenon of this kid's out of control, I can't handle them, come get them. Yet another placement and another sense of being disowned by someone who's supposed to be taking care of them. So great opportunity to develop under Families First those qualified programs that may include treatment foster parents or professional foster parents to deal with this population.
We're nearing the end of our time for this webinar session. Are there any other comments that any of our three faculty and presenters would like to make as we close?
I would simply like to say that this is one of those areas that the more you learn, the more you find out that there's you don't know enough. And I applaud those who are participating, who are asking questions. And again, we need to keep learning because it's not about us anyway. It's about the families and the children we serve. And the better equipped we are with more knowledge to respond to the unique needs of each child, not as a group, not as a cubbyhole we put everybody in and treat them the same. But thank you all for your interest, and I just encourage you to keep learning more.
I want to thank our faculty for sharing their knowledge and experiences with us today. Thank you to all of our participants for making the time to participate in this conversation about such an important topic. I do want to note that the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges is hosting the next National Judicial Institute on Domestic Child Sex Trafficking in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in just a couple of weeks on November 18th through the 20th. This is an intensive 2.5-day training program for judges and judicial officers. You can use this link on the slide for more information about our child sex trafficking prevention initiative and also for information about the Institute. I will now turn this over to Patricia for final instructions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sherry, and thank you all for joining our webinar today. Just a final reminder that this webinar will be posted on our council's website, so when all of that gets processed, I'll be sure to send out an email to all of the registered individuals when it is ready for viewing. And also we have a short evaluation that we would like for you to complete, and so that should come up on your screens in just a moment when I close out. So thank you all again for joining us today. I hope you all have a wonderful day.